to have you join us today. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Lee Ji-yoon in Seoul. Coming up on today's edition of Business Daily. Korea cuts its growth outlook for next year, citing growing uncertainties in the U.S. and weak domestic consumption. Curbing household debt and effectively carrying out the corporate restructuring drive. These two issues top the government's to-do list for next year amid slowing growth. These stories and more coming right up. As the Korean economy faces mounting uncertainties, the government slashes its growth outlook for next year to below 3%. It has also laid out a number of policy guidelines to tackle the risks head-on. Our Kim Min-ji starts us off.
With a wealth of uncertainties ahead, the Korean government has slashed its economic growth outlook to 2.6% for next year, down from an earlier forecast of 3%. This would potentially put the country's growth in the 2% range for the third consecutive year.
The recovery in the global economy remains weak, and there are concerns of further rate hikes in the U.S. and increased trade protectionism. At home, consumption is slumping, while growing household debt and corporate restructuring are taking a toll on the economy.
In 2017, the government plans to use expansionary policies to better tackle the uncertainties and bolster the livelihoods of the people and put the economy back on track. To do that, it will allocate a stimulus package worth $16.5 billion, which includes corporate loans from state-run policy lenders and public investment to speed up sputtering growth and generate more jobs. The government will also step up financial and tax incentives to boost investment and encourage consumer spending. As for stabilizing the livelihoods of the people, the government plans to add 60,000 new jobs in the public sector, as well as improve job conditions for workers in general. It will also provide tax breaks for companies that offer full-time work for young job seekers. To address broader social issues like the low birth rate, the government will extend more incentives for married couples and raise maternity leave allowances. And to stay on top of future trends, the government will set up a body comprising public officials and experts to keep policy up to speed with the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution.
The government has put much focus on fiscal policies, seemingly taking into account the slump in investment and consumption. It's doing what needs to be done, but given the dire economic conditions, as well as a change in leadership after the presidential election next year, the policies may not produce the desired effects.
In an effort to counter the many unknowns at home and abroad, the government plans to use nearly 70% of next year's $330 billion budget in the first half of the year.
Korea is now in a situation where it can only depend on fiscal policy, as it's not in the position to further ease its monetary policy, especially with the recent U.S. rate hike. With growth still feeble and the country's fiscal health relatively sound, there is a growing chance the government could draw up another supplementary budget.
Although the government has said it will look at first quarter performance before deciding whether to introduce an extra budget, experts say it's important that it places the priority in containing prevailing pessimism, which is already weighing on the economy. Kim Min-ji, Business Daily.
And more from the government. Acting President Prime Minister Hwang KyoAhn has vowed to ensure that both the government and public sector play an active role in supporting the economy in the coming year. Chairing a policy meeting with economic and finance-related ministers on Thursday, Hwang said the nation's financial system must fully mobilize its resources in anticipation of difficult times ahead. Hwang also said the government must work to lift the economic sentiment and encourage young Koreans to start their own businesses. He added that Korea will also monitor the U.S. incoming Trump administration's new trade and fiscal policies. Korea's production output across all sectors rebounded 1.6% last month compared to the month before, and by 4.6% on year. It's especially significant as it's the first on-month gain after 2 months of flat growth and another 2 in negative territory. Statistics Korea says the spike comes as the semiconductor and automobile sectors performed better, with the protracted unionized auto strike coming to an end. Industrial output in the mining, manufacturing, gas, and electricity sectors jumped nearly 3.5% on month. But manufacturers' business sentiment was unchanged at 72 for December, as companies remain concerned about slowing exports and growing global competition. A reading below 100 means pessimists outnumber optimists. With Korea battling its worst ever bird flu outbreak, the country is running out of eggs. And the shortage in supply is casting a shadow over the local economy and putting a damper on consumer sentiment ahead of the New Year holiday. Our Shin-semin reports.
Kim Hyun-suk, who churns out tens of hundreds of Korean-style pancakes known as chun every day, is one of many Koreans feeling the pinch of the current egg shortage.
It's not easy for us to raise our prices because of the conception that traditional markets serve inexpensive food.
She says the business has been losing more than it's making. And the same is true for local bakers.
We used to get our eggs from a wholesale market, but with the current shortage, we're seeing different retail markets, though even then it's difficult to meet our budget.
If the situation were to continue for several months, the pastry chef says they'd have to change the kind of bread they make. With the deadly avian influenza virus spreading, over 27 million birds, or nearly a quarter of the country's poultry population, have been culled since the first case was confirmed in mid-November. Most of these birds are egg-laying chickens, and their absence has caused egg prices to shoot up.
About a month ago, this carton of 30 eggs sold for 5,400 won, or $4.50. But now the average retail price for this same carton of egg is at least 7,500 won, or $6.20. That's a nearly 35% jump compared to the month before, and the highest price tag for eggs seen in over 3 years.
Some say the egg shortage could continue for a year or even longer. A local economic research institute projects that the economic losses could amount to $1.2 billion. That's if the infection rate hits 30% based on previous outbreaks. The institute adds that the secondary and tertiary damages could even dent distributors' sales, as more local governments are prohibiting the movement of related equipment and products. On top of that, the egg price hike could even put a damper on consumer sentiment, which is already in the doldrums.
Consumer sentiment, which is already in a dire state due to the ongoing political scandal, could shrink even more, with food prices, including egg prices, skyrocketing.
Despite all that, consumers are hoping that they won't have to shell out any more for eggs than they have to during the Lunar New Year, when families gather to celebrate with grand buffets of food and drinks. Shin-semin, Business Daily.
The Korean economy has set numerous records this year, but the most concerning would be its massive and still growing household debt. Not only is it enormous in size, it's growing at a rapid pace, fastest among emerging economies. In fact, latest data show that average household debt increased more rapidly than income last year. On top of this, the country's backbone industries like shipping, shipbuilding, and steel have been struggling with falling exports and sluggish economic growth. Among them, the big three shipyards have been trying to stay afloat, leading the government to spearhead intensive corporate restructuring drive. So with this year coming to an end, how should the government address these lingering risks? Take a look.
Korea's household debt swelled to a record high in the third quarter, rising to $1.1 trillion as of end September, an 11% jump on year. The massive debt pile has prompted the government to push for stricter loan screening by banks on mortgages and lending from so-called mutual finance institutions. Concerns are further mounting now that the U.S. Federal Reserve has increased interest rates, which have driven up global yields as well as domestic rates. Experts warn that Korean debtors should brace for a heavier repayment burden, as U.S. rates are expected to rise further next year. Another challenge is in Korea's shipping and shipbuilding industries, which went through immense difficulties this year, as falling orders and sluggish global growth pushed down sales and pushed up debt levels. The government launched a corporate restructuring initiative in an attempt to reboot the flagging industries, but not without criticism about the effectiveness of such efforts. So how will the Korean economy address some of these major challenges and bolster growth in the new year?
And to tell us more about this, Professor Shin Se-don of Sungmyung Women's University joins us in the studio today. Hello, Professor.
My pleasure.
All right, so the Bank of Korea lowered the key rate to a record low of 1.25% this year to spur growth. But do you think the snowballing household debt has undermined the efforts?
Definitely, I think the Bank of Korea rate has been 2.75% about 3 years ago. Now it dropped to 1.25, which is the lowest level in Korean history. The problem is that initially the Bank of Korea wanted to boost investment and consumption, but the actual effect has been, not much effect has been shown in increased investment and consumption. So investment and consumption has been not affected, and only the borrowing from the banking institutions to finance the housing market bubble on the one hand, and about the half of the borrowing has been spent on the small business operation costs. So the very fast increasing household debt means, on the one hand, the housing market bubble, and on the other, the real economy, especially for the small business, has been so bad that they have to rely too much upon the borrowing.
Now, I think tightening from the Federal Reserve, U.S. Fed Reserve, is also adding to our concerns, since it could encourage the BOK to raise rates as well. Then what impact would this have on households with debts?
Well, definitely, recently the Federal Reserve announced that next year, 2017, they are expected to increase 3 times, and another 3 times 2018, and another 3 times in 2019. So from 3 years from now, the Federal Reserve will raise the interest rate at least by 2.5% percentage point. So if that is so, Bank of Korea has to raise the rate at least to 2 or 3% from now, and that's going to have a pretty significant effect upon the pace of increase in household debts on the one hand, and the burden for the household debts, because they have to pay at least 2% more for their previous loans.
Now, many also forecast that Korea's household debt is going to grow even more next year. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, if interest rate goes up and the price of housing has been dipping down, many expect it to be so next year, then the growth of household debt will come down, not as much as 18% this year. So it's going to come down definitely. But the problem is interest rate has become very high next year and year after that. And 1% increase in interest rate means about 13 trillion increased burden for the interest payment. And that is about 2% of total private consumption. If interest rate goes up by 1%, because of that, consumption will shrink by 2 percentage points. That's going to have a devastating effect upon domestic demand.
Definitely. So the government has been putting out some various measures to curb household debt, but how effective do you think these were? And what kind of measures do you think the government should put forth next year?
So far, interest rate has been so low that the government has not successful in restraining the household debts. But next year and year after that, if market rates goes up, then I think definitely people will reduce reliance upon borrowing. So I think the speed of growth of household debt will definitely damp down next year and year after that. So the size and the speed of growth of housing debt isn't going to be the real trouble for the Korean economy. Real trouble is if interest rate goes up, then the private people's burden for interest payment has become so huge that that's going to have a lot of social and economic problems for the Korean society.
Now, the sad news is that despite the growing debt burden, a large number of Koreans are losing their jobs because of the ongoing corporate restructuring drive. So how much success have we seen from these government-led efforts this year?
Well, the government has been trying to trying to restrain rely mainly upon the providing financial liquidity for the trouble industry like shipbuilding and the shipping industry. So main restructuring initiative has to be put on the individual firms concerned. So some companies like Hyundai or Hanjin or those shipbuilding industries, they have to set out many self-rescue plan. And so far, it's in first stage, so it's too early to tell whether those self-rescue plan has been successful. And we have to wait next year and year after that whether the self-rescue plan and the government supplying of financial liquidity will come out successful or not.
All right, so Korean industries are likely to continue their struggles for a time being and probably into next year as well. So what tasks remain for the Korean government then to better manage household debt and also better carry out the ongoing corporate restructuring drive?
As I said, if market interest goes up and the housing market bubble calms down, I think the household debt is not going to be the serious trouble year after that, this year and next year. So real trouble is, as I said, about half of the household debts are because of a small business who has been suffering from slow economy. So the government has to pay a lot more attention to those suffering small businesses. That is one thing. And the second thing is that, so far the government has been too much concerned about the big companies like, Hyundai shipbuildings. And so now the government has to switch their concern from the big companies to many small and medium-sized enterprises. So that has to be the task of the government 2017 and on.
All right. Thank you so much for your insight today, Professor.
You're welcome.
And that brings us to the end, but we'll be back tomorrow with more business news that matters to you. So don't forget to tune in then. Thanks for watching and see you soon.